Okay, welcome to the Read Aloud for Friday. Here we go. All right. Long streamers of ebony fabric flowed from the spectral room and entangling nearby fairies. The ensnared fairies began to lose their luster and wither. The silvery fairy appeared, slicing through the fabric with her axe of fire. Other fairies joined her, using gleaming swords to sever the black material. The fairies swirling around Bahamut now held ropes. They looked like the ropes that had crisscrossed the front of the alcove, except now they appeared to be woven out of gold. Bahamut kept roaring and swinging and biting, but the ropes were beginning to tangle him up. Knots were forming in them. The draconic creature was slowing down, his great jaws clamped shut, tearing off the gauzy wing of a fairy with markings like a ladybug. The spectral woman turned and drifted away, her ethereal wrappings no longer quite as flowing. The fairies ignored her departure. A pair of fairies had taken hold of Muriel and they flung her at Bahamut. Soon she was bound to the demon by flaxen cords. She screeched as her body shriveled with age and her gown turned to rags. 3 fairies alighted atop the demon's head and they each grabbed a horn and tore it out. The demon wailed. Dozens of fairies seized the ropes binding the demon and hurled Bahamut back into the alcove. Busily, the fairies began threading knotted ropes back and forth over the entrance. Kendra turned. The blue, furry fairy gestured toward the orangutan and the shackles binding it to the wall fell apart. Another gesture, and a burst of light changed the orangutan into Grandpa Sorensen. The albino fairy pulled the convulsing catfish from the aquarium and changed it back into Lena. "Where's my grandma?" Kendra cried. The red-haired fairy who had freed Seth approached the aquarium. She lifted out a small putrid slug that had been clinging to the side above the water and changed it back into Grandma. Grandma Sorensen massaged her temples, and I thought my mind was muddy as a chicken, she muttered. Grandpa hurried over and embraced her. Do you need milk?" Kendra asked, holding out the bottle to her grandfather. He shook his head. "We have not slept, so the veil has not yet covered our eyes." A group of fairies gathered near the alcove, extending their arms, palms downward. Soil, clay, and stone began flowing together and piling up until Hugo was reborn. The golem stretched and let out a groan to rival the roars of the banished demon. The fairies busily healed one another, mending wings and closing wounds. One circle of fairies spread their arms, and fragments of glass skittered together, took the form of a pair of fairies, then came back to life. Several other fairies joined hands and started humming. Particles of ash swirled loosely in their mists, but refused to coalesce. The fairies released one another, and the ash dissipated. Some fairies, it seemed, were beyond rescue. Several fairies took hold of Hugo and lifted him out of the basement. Others did the same for Grandpa and Grandma, Lena, Seth, and Kendra. Airborne again, Kendra had a view of the destroyed church. The wreckage spread across the clearing for a couple hundred yards. The forgotten chapel had not simply been flung aside, it had been obliterated. The fairies set them down a good distance from the wreckage and the basement. All except Lena. 2 fairies were carrying her away. The former naiad was having harsh words with them in a foreign tongue, struggling in their grasp. Kendra touched Grandma Sorensen's arm and nodded toward the commotion. "Nothing to be done about it," he sighed as the fairies hauled Lena away. He had an arm around Grandma, holding her back. "Hey," Kendra shouted, "bring Lena back here." The fairies holding Lena paid her no heed, passing out of sight into the woods. The remainder of the fairies assembled above the basement, floating in an enormous ring. They had more than tripled their numbers with all the imps they had reclaimed. Kendra had seen many fairies fall during the battle, but most had been revived and healed by the magic of their comrades. The radiant fairies raised their arms together and started singing. The music sounded impromptu, full of hundreds of interweaving melodies with almost no harmonies. As they sang, the ground in the clearing began to undulate. The wreckage from the church slid across the field, clattering into the open basement. The ground began to quake, the walls of the basement crumbled, and the surrounding area folded in and swallowed it up. The field heaved like a stormy sea. As the undulation subsided, the basement had been replaced by a low hill. The fairy choir became more shrill. Wild flowers and fruit trees began sprouting throughout the clearing and on the hill, coming to full bloom in a matter of seconds. Flowers blossomed all over Hugo, who offered no reaction. When the singing finally ceased, the cheery hill covered by a fragrant array of brilliant blossoms and mature fruit trees had replaced the forgotten chapel. They made Hugo look like a fruity, Seth complained. The legion of fairies glided toward him, scooped them up, and carried them on a breakneck flight home. Kendra relished being part of the mercurial procession, overjoyed at the fortunate ending to the terrible night. Seth whooped the whole way as if he were riding the coolest roller coaster on the planet. Finally, the fairies deposited them in the yard where Dale stood waiting. "Now I've seen everything," he said as Grandpa and Grandma Sorensen were set down beside him. The fairy with the short blue hair and silver wings stood before Kendra. "Thank you," Kendra said. "You did wonderfully. We can never repay you." The silver fairy gave a single nod, eyes glittering. As if responding to a signal, the fairies crowded Kendra, each in turn giving her a quick kiss. As each kiss was bestowed, the fairy reverted to her former size amid dazzling sparks and darted away. The rapid succession of kisses brought overpowering sensations, and Kendra smelled the earthly aromas of the fairy queen, rich soil and young blossoms. She tasted honey and fruit and berries, all sweet beyond comparison. She heard the music of rainfall, the cry of wind, the roar of the sea. She felt as if the warmth of the sun were embracing her, flowing through her. The fairies kissed her eyes, her cheeks, her ears, her brow. When the last of more than 300 fairies kissed her, okay, so somebody called me while I was filming, and so it paused the video. So I'm going to splice this back in. That's why it breaks up. Let's see, where were we? When the last of more than 300 fairies had kissed her, Kendra stumbled back and sat down on the grass. So I better start my timer again. In fact, she was mildly surprised that she did not float away, so she felt so light and drowsy. Grandpa and Dell helped Kendra to her feet. "I would wager that this young lady has quite a story to tell," Grandpa said, "and I would also wager that now is not the time. Hugo, attend to your labors." Dale was helping Kendra to the house. She felt euphoric and distant. She was glad her family was safe, but she felt so inexplicably blissful, and the troubles of the evening seemed so remote that she began to wonder whether it had all been a surreal dream. Grandpa was holding hands with Grandma. "I'm sorry it took so long to get you back," he said softly. "I can guess at the reason," she said. "We need to talk about you eating my eggs." "They weren't your eggs," Grandpa protested. "They were the eggs of the hen your mind was inhabiting. And I'm glad you can be so detached. There may still be a couple in the fridge." Kendra stumbled on her way up the porch steps. Grandpa and Dale helped her onto the porch and into the house. The furniture was back. Nearly all of it had been restored with some alterations. A couch had been reconstructed as a chair. Some lampshades were made of different materials. Jewels had been added to a picture frame. Could the brownies have worked so fast? Her eyes were drooping. Grandpa was holding Grandma's hand, whispering something in her ear. Seth was chattering, but the words made no sense. Dale held her shoulders, guiding her. They were almost to the stairs, but she could not keep her eyes open. She felt herself falling and hands catching her, and then consciousness fled. Chapter 19. Farewell to Fablehaven. Kendra and Grandpa reclined in the wagon while Hugo pulled them down the road at a leisurely pace. The morning was clear and bright, with a few thin high clouds barely clinging to existence. Accidental brush strokes on a blue canvas. The day would be hot, but for now it was pleasant. A couple of fairies drifted alongside the wagon and waved at Kendra. She waved back and they sped away, weaving around one another. The garden now teemed with fairies, and they paid Kendra a lot of special attention. They seemed pleased whenever she acknowledged them. We haven't really gotten to talk since it all happened, Kendra said. You were sleeping half the time, Grandpa replied. It was true. She had slept for 2 days and 2 nights straight after the ordeal, a personal best. All those kisses knocked me out, she said. You excited to see your parents? Asked Grandpa. Yes and no. It was the 3rd day since Kendra had awakened. Her parents were coming to pick them up this afternoon. Going home will seem bland after all this. Well, you'll have fewer demons to worry about. Kendra smiled. True. Grandpa folded his arms. What you did was so special, I don't know how to speak about it. It barely seems real. Oh, it was real. You mended an irreparable situation and saved all of our lives in the process. The fairies have not gone to war for centuries. In that state, their power is virtually unrivaled. Bahamut did not stand a chance. What you did was so brave and so doomed to failure. I can't think of anyone I know who would have even tried it. It felt like my only hope. Why do you think the Fairy Queen helped me? Your guess is as good as mine. Maybe to save the preserve. Maybe she sensed the sincerity of your intentions. Your youth must have helped. I'm sure fairies would much rather follow a little girl into battle than some pompous general. But the truth is, I never would have guessed it would have worked. It was a miracle. Hugo stopped the cart. Grandpa climbed down, then helped Kendra. She held the silver bowl that she had taken from the island. They started down a faint path toward an archway and a tall, unkempt hedge. Weird how I don't have to drink the milk anymore, Kendra said. On the morning she awoke after the fairy kisses, when she went to the window, she saw fairies fluttering about. It had taken a moment to register that she had not yet consumed any milk that day. I'll admit that it worries me somewhat, Grandpa said. Creatures of whimsy are not solely confined to the preserves. The blindness of mortals can be a blessing. Take care where you look. I'd rather see things how they are, Kendra declared. They passed under the archway. A group of satyrs were playing tag with several slender maidens wearing flowers in their hair. The paddle boat was adrift in the middle of the pond. Fairies skimmed the surface of the water and soared among the gazebos. I'll be curious to know what other changes the fairies wrought in you, Grandpa said. I've never heard of such a thing. You'll let me know if you discover any other oddities, like if I turn Seth back into a walrus? I'm glad you can joke about it, but I'm serious. They walked up the steps to the nearest pavilion. Just toss it in, Kendra asked. I think it would be best, Grandpa said. If the bowl came from the island, you should give it back. There's a picture. Kendra threw the bowl in like a frisbee. It landed in the water, and almost immediately a hand shot up and snatched it. Okay, we'll read more tomorrow. No cliffhanger today.